Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. I haven't said much about this case because it involves celebrity and entertainment, and while that's catnip to a lot of black folks, it's castor oil to me. When it comes to the people involved, there's no one that I care to cheer for, but as for the white media's focus on this, well, that is worth commenting on. The first thing, though, that I want to say is all the people are talking about how this verdict has gotten him fired by Marvel. Marvel has now fired him. Anyone who thinks that Marvel was ever going to have this guy back for even a minute, you're a fool. They made their minds up a long time ago on that one. This verdict merely saved them the awkwardness of having to make up an explanation for why they didn't want him back, while simultaneously announcing who they've recast him with. This is not about Jonathan Majors, however, any more than my videos about Bill Cosby or R. Kelly were about them. I say that because there are some folks who get stuck on stupid whenever we talk about these issues, and it comes down to, well, who were they snuggling up with? Who were they having relations with? We already know about that. This is not about them. You have the same contingent of clowns, however, who are desperate to certify that black men are uniquely criminal. When Bill Cosby was getting raked over the coals and he got convicted, you had white media suck-ups like Eli Mistal, who were mad as hell at Bill Cosby, and they were also celebrating him being sent to prison because, well, I guess because he dared to claim that he was innocent. That seemed to be the main thing that they were angry about. How dare he claim that he's innocent? By the way, this goofball Eli Mistal, he never ever went that hard over Harvey Weinstein or even Donald Trump. There's a number of these meat puppets online who are dedicated to demonizing black men, and they've had a field day with the whole Jonathan Majors conviction. Now, while a lot of these Twitter and YouTube accounts are surely white racist sock puppets, it's also true that a lot of them are not. These bootlicks look at what their white paymasters in the white media say, or who they hope will pay them to say these things. And then these sock puppets mindlessly repeat it. That's their job, or rather the one that they're desperately hoping they'll get. Just yesterday, we were talking about Malika Andrews and how ESPN uses her to demonize, slander, and defame black men while making sure not to say anything even remotely critical of white athletes. So what we're seeing is standard operating procedure for them. Don't kid yourself. These people aren't just coming out of nowhere. When the Cosby verdict was predictably thrown out because it was illegal, these same bootlicks were furious. You had Eli Mistal cursing and ranting like he lost his mind, assuming he ever had one. They were going overboard to show that they were more outraged that Cosby had been set free than the white racists that they work for on cable TV. These clowns who do this, they're auditioning for a white media job, or perhaps a better one than what they've already got. Before we go any further, though, I'm sure we'll have some clowns saying the same thing here that we heard about Nate Parker when he was being smeared in the white media. They'll point out that he was with a white woman, so he can't be surprised when this happens. Again, this isn't about Jonathan Majors personally. The white media isn't covering him so prominently because he made a name for himself in Hollywood. They're doing this because he's black, and this is what they like to do. This is their tradition. Doesn't mean we put on the cape for him, no pun intended. But it does mean we need to understand why these things are happening. Danny Masterson didn't get anywhere near as much attention as Jonathan Majors has, and Masterson was convicted of raping 2 women and charged with raping 3. He didn't allegedly get into a physical altercation with one woman where she gave as good as she got, who, by the way, was on video chasing after him. That's what happened to Jonathan Majors, though. If Majors was indeed the aggressor all throughout this, and this delicate, fragile white woman who he was ruthlessly brutalizing was innocent and lucky that he didn't kill her, then why did she chase after him across several blocks of the city? Strange thing to do with somebody who you were scared was going to kill you. He fled the alleged scene of the crime. So why did she chase him halfway across the city? Look, no matter what you may think of Jonathan Majors personally, and I'm certainly not part of his fan club, the reality is the NYPD arrested his accuser, but the DA's office made it clear that the fix was in from the jump, because the prosecutors said from the very start that they didn't care what the NYPD told them, they didn't care what evidence the NYPD had, they would not prosecute this woman under any circumstances. They were not going to bring charges against her no matter what. They said that before an arrest had even been made. Now, have you ever in your entire life heard of a DA's office telling the police, we don't care if you do make an arrest, we're not going to try to bring any charges? Have you ever heard, especially of the DA's office in New York, telling the NYPD, you go and arrest somebody, we're telling you in advance, we're not bringing any charges, we're not going to prosecute? When do they ever do that? Answer, they don't. So the DA's office was not conducting an investigation. It was conducting a railroading. They wanted Jonathan Majors to be put on trial. Evidence and facts be damned. They could care less about what really happened. The decision had already been made that they were going after him and him alone. Mia Ponsetto was caught on video assaulting a black child, but Alvin Bragg refused to punish her. He said, let's just go ahead and let her go. And that racist attack was caught on video. There's no doubt what happened there. It's not that Jonathan Majors was some huge criminal, it's that he's black, and the white media hasn't had a black celebrity to demonize in such a long time. They needed one. Gotta keep up that steady drumbeat. Ultimately, though, the responsibility for this fiasco rests with Mr. Majors himself. I made a video around the time of his arraignment in which I pointed out that too many of these Negroes in Hollywood and in entertainment in general refuse to take control of who is in their circle. They just keep letting people around them who shouldn't be. They ignore all the warning signs. A month ago, Will Smith had an incident where a former so-called assistant of his claimed, without a shred of evidence, mind you, that he had walked in on Will Smith and Dwayne Martin having a gay sexual encounter. Not surprisingly, this hanger-on announced that he also is planning to write a book. I guess this is his idea of pre-publicity. What his book's going to be about, I can't imagine. The guy has no talent, he has no stories to tell. All he can do is spin yarns about the real celebrities who he was in the orbit of briefly. And since nobody knew who this guy was before last week, and most of you already forgot who he was before I reminded you, this shows how important he's not. And yes, it has been long surmised, even by those of us in the black media, that Will Smith is most likely bisexual, if not bi-curious. But it's also true that this Belial character is just trying to make a quick buck for himself. Without Will Smith, he wouldn't exist. He was simply part of Smith's entourage. And this is what he does to repay him for that. Between this guy and Jada Pinkett, Will Smith has more zeros around him than Pearl Harbor. You want to know why certain important people have a turnover in personnel, why they regularly dismiss people from their staffs, even the ones who didn't break their rules, or they do it for the smallest misstep? It's because they can't afford to keep people around too long. It becomes dangerous. When you climb the ladder, people start scheming against you. And when it comes to black men, the easiest way to get his money is to claim rape or a beating or both. It's a formula as old as white supremacy itself. Read Othello. Jonathan Majors chose to have this woman around, and he chose to keep her around. And some of the evidence that came out of trial pretty much made it clear that these two had already had issues before now. Clearly, he's not a good judge of character, to say the least. There was obviously some real dysfunction going on, and he wasn't handling his business. He wasn't keeping the chaos out of his operation. The first time you got problems with this woman, she's supposed to go. You ghost her, block her number, inform the doorman that she's not to be let in. Hell, go and file a restraining order. That way you've done it first before she can try to control the narrative. I don't know what it was that led Majors to have this woman around. I don't know what, if anything, she was doing that was so important that he thought he simply couldn't do without her. But now, she's cost him his career. And given how hard these New York Klansmen have been going after him, they might put him in prison before it's all over. You can practically count the seconds until that woman files a civil suit now that there's been a criminal conviction. Majors and his legal team are vowing to clear his name, but they've been saying that ever since this fiasco began. And the white media won't rehabilitate his image either, not like they do for every white celebrity or famous person who's accused of wrongdoing. See, they let everybody else live it down. If you're black, forget about it. Mel Gibson was recorded engaged in a racist, threatening rant with his then-girlfriend, and he was allowed to go right back to Hollywood making movies, directing movies as if nothing had changed. Roman Polanski raped and sodomized a child, he fled the U.S., and he's been working without skipping a beat. Big-name Hollywood stars still compete to be in his movies, and he's even won an Oscar, so the Academy has no problem recognizing him. Louis C.K. admits to sexually harassing his female co-workers, and the white media puts together a so-called documentary meant to celebrate his comeback. They don't mention any of these men's past behavior or crimes anymore. They put that in the past. Oh, we're not dealing with that anymore. Because they're the right skin color. Jonathan Majors isn't going to get that kind of treatment any more than Nate Parker did. And Nate Parker was acquitted of the false claims against him, but the white media still attacked him and called his accuser his victim. The target is always black men, and they'll go out of their way to do it. Now, before I make my next point, I think I should warn you in advance that some of you are probably not going to like it, but hear me out before you go yelling at your cell phone or desktop computer. The current white media obsession with removing Clarence Thomas from the Supreme Court also stems from the same motivation as their obsession with Bill Cosby, Nate Parker, Jonathan Majors, and all the rest. Now, before you lose your mind, I'm not a fan of Uncle Thomas. I'm certainly not defending him. I've excoriated him in the past and will continue to do so. I just want it to be clear, the white left's obsession with removing him from the Supreme Court in specific is because when it comes to setting these scandalous precedents, making these infamous firsts, they always want to make sure that it's a black person that they can use as their precedent setter. The first time we had to do this, it was some nigger that we had to do this with. Clarence Thomas is a sellout and a political prostitute. He's all the things they call him and worse. He deserves whatever ill fortune comes his way. And yes, the main motivation that the white left has for targeting him is because they're trying to reduce the conservative majority on the Supreme Court. I have no problem with that. Clarence Thomas voted in favor of the totally illegal Shelby v. Holder ruling that crippled the Voting Rights Act, and he has been a shameless rubber stamp for the white right, and when Harlan Crow shows up, he gladly bends over and grabs the ankles. I have no problem with him being kicked off the court in disgrace. In fact, I hope it happens. He deserves it. But the problem is the white left is making it a point to remove him first. While judicial corruption is rampant throughout the United States, most judges at all levels are taking money from someone. Most of them are on the take, that's just a fact. And the U.S. Supreme Court is no different. In the U.S., these judges never get punished, but for the white left, their all-consuming fixation on Thomas isn't simply because he's been taking money from rich racist billionaires. They specifically want to remove him first so that a black person will be the face for this kind of action. The precedent will be set with him, though virtually everything that they're saying about Clarence Thomas also applies equally to another ultra-conservative lunatic on the Supreme Court, Sam Alito. Except the difference between Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas is there's actually a strong case to remove Sam Alito, in fact far stronger than the one against Clarence Thomas, and even the white media has to admit this.
Yeah, it's now let's just be clear. We've never been able to identify any one of the benefactors, the many benefactors of Thomas. Harlan Crow's chief among them, but you've got Blockbuster's Wayne Huizenga, you've got several other guys. They never had cases that were directly in front of the court in the kind of extremely bald manner where Thomas did something unusual and you could see, well, there must be some quid pro quo there. We don't have that. We did report earlier this year that Sam Alito went on a lavish trip with Leonard Leo, Leo, one of the conservative activists, funded with a hedge fund billionaire who was a conservative activist who then had a case before the court and Alito didn't recuse. With Thomas, we haven't had that.
If they really wanted to go after corruption on the Supreme Court and they were trying to reach the low-hanging fruit, Sam Alito is the one that they should be aiming to remove first. Sam Alito is every bit as racist as his predecessor, Antonin Scalia. Both of them are reprobates with no redeeming qualities. Sam Alito's the one who should be impeached and removed first, and they actually have examples of pay for play from him. Yet all we hear about is Clarence Thomas. Again, this is no defense of Clarence Thomas. If they do actually pressure him into resigning or otherwise put some sort of strictures on him that make his life harder, you're not going to have any tears from me. I'm just telling you, understand what their motivation is, why it is that they want to start with him. You can't separate that from this equation. And on a side note, if the white left wants to be mad about the GOP having a supermajority on the Supreme Court, they can blame their hero, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for that. She was dying of cancer, she knew she was dying, and she had had plenty of time to resign beforehand, but she refused. Because as she saw it, that Supreme Court seat was hers. She wasn't letting it go until she died. It was her property. She owned it. And she was going to hold on to it because as long as she was on the Supreme Court, she was important. She was a somebody. She knew that the moment she resigned, she would go right back to what she had been before Bill Clinton plucked her from obscurity. And that is a nothing. So this woman, who the white left revered so much and sang her praises, I told you about how she was every bit as racist as Antonin Scalia. Go back in the archives on this YouTube channel to check out my takedown of Ginsburg. But it was her stubborn refusal to resign during the Obama years that directly led to the Supreme Court being handed over to the GOP, because she died on Trump's watch and he got to choose her replacement. It didn't have to go that way. It shouldn't have gone that way, but her ego and her pride was far greater than her common sense or her sense of ideology. So if the white left really wants to be mad at someone over how the Supreme Court is overwhelmingly conservative, They should be mad at her, but they're not. Her transgressions have also been allowed to fall down the memory hole, as always happens when the person being talked about isn't black. Now, I'm pretty sure for a lot of you, you were not at all expecting this take from me, but it's been on my mind for a while whenever I see people in the white media who are getting a full head of steam about Clarence Thomas. Again, for the people who weren't listening, I'm not defending him. Whatever he gets, as long as it's not good, he deserves it. But I'm telling you that there's a reason the white left is focused on him. Clarence Thomas can't be impeached. The Democrats don't control the House, and even if they did, they don't have the votes to convict him in the Senate. So all this wailing about Thomas needs to resign, and what about ethics standards in the Supreme Court, it's largely meaningless. The way the Constitution is written, he really can't be touched, and they know this. He does the bidding of the white megadonors, who also give huge donations to the GOP, and the Democrats, truth be told. So as long as he toes the line, he's politically insulated. This constant need for the white left to talk about Clarence Thomas is actually a form of political messaging. It's meant to appeal to white educated suburbanites of a centrist bent, or as I like to call them, casual racists. That's the real audience for this Thomas pile-on. Black Supreme Court justice, point out his corruption and make it seem like he's the only one who's this dirty, and don't mention any of the others. And even if you have a better case against him, don't mention that. And the working theory for the Democrats is that if they do this long enough, those white suburbanites are going to look and say, well, I think I better vote differently come next year. We really got to get Clarence Thomas out of there. They're pushing every button that they can. Immigration, abortion, Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court, the whole 9 yards. The kitchen sink strategy, that's what it is, even though it is deserved. Nonetheless, Jonathan Majors is the latest black celebrity now to learn the hard way that all the Hollywood parties in the hills that he was invited to, all the white executives who patted him on the back and told him they were going to make him a star, and now he's on the inside, they told him. It was all hot air. The very first time some anonymous white person accuses you of something, they'll all immediately drop you, and it will be wall-to-wall attacks. And the same people who pretended to be so impressed with him would be the main ones saying we knew he was dirty all along. Black celebrities will never figure it out. If you refuse to be ruthless about getting rid of problem people in your circle, then those problem people will become ruthless about getting rid of you. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Gwendolyn Langston, Sherman Marshall, Kenneth Johnson, Antonio Daniels, and Isaac. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.